Chris, what is our second main topic today?
This one comes from Allan Walsh. Read a story about Peter Dinklage absolutely going off on the fact that they're making another Snow White movie. I hope I'm not misunderstanding him, but it seems like his problem is that he doesn't want the Snow White story told at all because of how dwarves are portrayed as 7 dwarves living in a cave together. I've never thought about it at all when thinking about Snow White. Is Dinklage right to be upset?
All right, thanks a lot for saying that in, man. And yeah, look, there's few people in this world that I get as excited when they're going to be in an upcoming project as Peter Dinklage.
Absolutely.
I love this dude. And when Aaron, we've told this story, but when Aaron and I were at CinemaCon, there was a bunch of things that we knew about coming in. There's a few things that kind of came out of nowhere and surprised us. One of the things that they showed us was the new Peter Dinklage project, Cyrano.
Yes.
Playing on the classic Cyrano de Bergerac storyline. That, I think, might be, aside from comic book or sci-fi offerings, I think that might be my number one most anticipated movie of the year. Comic book and sci-fi stuff aside, it's Cyrano. I mean, they showed us like 10 minutes of it, and like Aaron and I were just both like, oh my God. Like, I'm already a fan of it. Whether you go back to Gerard Depardieu or you talk about Steve Martin's Roxanne, which, by the way, if you haven't seen Steve Martin's Roxanne with Daryl Hannah, you totally need to see Roxanne. It's great. But again, it's a play on that story, and I love it. And of course, he's won multiple Emmys for Game of Thrones and all that kind of stuff. So they're making a Snow White and the Seven Dwarves. And apparently Peter Dinklage is very upset about it. And now this is what he had to say. This comes to us from the folks over at Variety, quoting him. He's saying, "There's a lot of hypocrisy going on," Dinklage said. "Literally, no offense to anyone, but I was a little taken aback when they were proud to cast a Latina actress as Snow White, of course, the young woman who stars in West Side Story, big breakout role for her. But you're still telling the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarves. Take a step back and look at what you're doing there. It makes no sense to me," Dinklage continued. "You're progressive in one way, but then you're still making that fucking backwards story about 7 dwarves living in a cave together. What the fuck are you doing, man? Have I done nothing to advance the cause from my soapbox? I guess I'm not loud enough. I'm just like, what are you doing?" So that comes to us, again, from Variety, quoting Peter Dinklage. And listen, I'll tell you what. I was a little taken aback by his comments here. Because look, let's be real here.
Hope he never goes to Moria.
Yeah. And I'll get to that in a second. But let's be real here. Everybody is sensitive about how their demographic is portrayed. And when I say everybody, I don't mean other people, everybody. I mean everybody, including everybody in this room, including everybody watching this. You may think you're not, but you really are. We all are to some degree.
Of course.
You know, when I see a stupid Italian on screen, I'm just like,
I get so mad.
I get so mad. Just like, come on, man.
When it's that boopity boppity shit, I'm like, oh, thank you so much for that.
Yes, that's great. Although I will say there's a Family Guy episode. You know the one I'm talking about? Yeah. Peter walks into an Italian restaurant. And he's like, "Don't worry, Brian, I got this." And he starts talking to the guy at the counter. A boopity boppity beepity boopity beep. And it's like, Peter, that's not how Italian works. But I got to admit, I laughed my ass off at that. But everybody is sensitive, including straight white males. Straight white males may be the most sensitive about how they're portrayed or whatever. But everybody is. And I guess for me, the reason I haven't really thought about this when I think about Snow White and the Seven Dwarves or Lord of the Rings, The Mines of Moria, or any other type of fantasy is this. I don't think of fantasy dwarves as real. They're not real. I think of them in the same way I think of elves. You know, tall, skinny people are not elves. Right? Elves are a fantasy. Elves are a thing.
Speak for yourself, pal.
So in my way of thinking, the elves are fantasy. They're not real. The race of the dwarven race in fantasy, like Lord of the Rings, like Snow White, I do not think of them as Peter Dinklage is thinking of, that they are a representation of real life people. Plus, and a certain demographic of people in our real world.
Also, like the dwarves in Tolkien are badasses.
Yeah,
yes. They're and my ox. Like no one looks at Gimli and goes, "Well, that guy's lesser than someone else. I mean,
No,
him
nobody
and
messes
Legolas
with the
compete
dwarves.
how many orcs they can kill at the Battle of Helm's Deep.
Nobody messes with the dwarves.
No, and
in the
you
Tolkien
know
world.
they the minds of Moria. They're capable people,
Right.
And but I've felt the same way. I mean, the dwarves in Snow White are industrious people. They're always going to work. You know, they're off to work they go,
and they can sing.
and they can sing, and they help Snow White. You know, but I understand where Peter Dinklage is coming from. I do, but like you said, I've never thought of fantasy. But then again, I'm not a little person, so
Right.
I don't know what that has meant to him throughout his life. But I've always thought of dwarves as being badasses. I've always liked them. So,
But is it verbiage? Is it because we use the word dwarf in real world stuff? Some people use that term. Is that why there's association? Because again, I have never in my life, honestly, until Peter brought it up, and I mean, and this is because I'm not. Until Peter brought it up, I never ever once equated in my head the dwarves in Lord of the Rings, the dwarves in Snow White, as being a counterpart to real life little people in our
Right.
world. I've never considered that at all for a second. But I'm not in his shoes, right? I'm not. I don't live his experience.
That's
I
right.
live a totally different experience. So I confess, I don't know how to feel about Peter's kind of statement here. Because on the one hand, I'm like, well, it's not. You know, the 7 dwarves in Snow White aren't like dwarves the way people think of them. It's a totally separate fantasy race. It's a completely different species. But at the same time, I go, I'm not in his shoes, though, so I'm not sure how I feel about this. Chris, you read Peter's statements here. What was your reaction to it? What was your initial kind of reaction to it when you read what he said?
You know, very similar to y'all in that, you know, thinking of these fantasy stories of, I love the dwarves. I think they're the most badass characters ever in Lord of the Rings. It's why my furry son is named Gimli. But like
Gimli,
you guys,
son of Gloin.
Gimli, son of Gloin. He's not as badass though. He doesn't have an axe. It's really disappointing. But like you all are saying, it is not my experience, and it's also not my place to tell somebody whether or not they are offended about how their experience could be portrayed.
Right.
I can understand if it is something you think of the Disney animated version, right? Where everyone's just kind of known by some weird little trait of like being sleepy or dopey or something like that. How that can kind of go down that rabbit hole of being incredibly offensive if it's just these kind of caricatures.
Right.
I'm hoping that's not the case, but I can understand being very, very wary of this, considering how much work Dinklage has done to be seen as an actor first, a person first, and not have, you know, these roles that typically in the past have been very, very caricature-y. He's
Right.
turned down all of those, or he's kind of put things on their head or found things that are elevated. He has done a lot of work. So I can understand his, you know, kind of rage here. Well, rage is an extreme word, but there's a lot of F-bombs in there. I can understand his frustration. There we go.
Rob, you like listening to him talk about, obviously he's very passionate about this. Clearly. Does he have a point to make? Should we look at how, even in the realm of fantasy, whether it's Lord of the Rings or Snow White, should we start looking at this character type of the dwarf? Should we start looking at them and maybe treating them differently?
You know, it's a tough call. I mean, I think that the easy answer would be to say yes. I mean, I absolutely do, because, you know, it's not like any human being that is outside of what we would call normal, or the general population, has an experience that I personally wouldn't know. And his experience can't be devalued, and I'm sure in his life, he personally has had to put up with all kinds of horrible
all kinds of
prejudice, you know, and I think one of the great things about Tyrion Lannister as a character, and like when I first saw Peter Dinklage, I think it was in The Station Agent.
Oh, so
that
good.
film. Such a great movie. And you know, it's funny because I don't think of Peter. The first thing I think about when I think of Peter Dinklage is not that he is a little person. I think of him as Tyrion Lannister, who should have won the Game of Thrones. If I had made the show, he would have won it, because he was the most badass guy. But and I've also never thought of the dwarves in Snow White as being anything I mean, they have traits that people have, you know, but I've never thought of them as being lesser people. I'm like, they're awesome, you know, and because I grew up reading Tolkien, Tolkien's work, the dwarves were awesome too. But, you know, maybe the Time Bandits were kind of not as awesome, but I still like them. So it really, I think that he has a good point, and it's something that should be considered.
Guys, question is for you. What do you think about Peter Dinklage's statements here? Are you like me and you thought, I've never even thought of dwarves in these movies and fantasy stories as being real? I mean, there was a totally separate it's a fantasy species, just like orcs, just like elves, not real.
Or giants.
Or giants. Whereas Peter Dinklage has lived a very different experience than us, and he looks at that and says, guys, wake up to it. I don't know. What do you guys think about what it is he said there? Has it caught you a little bit off guard? Has it made you think? Whatever you guys are thinking about this right now, jump down to the comment section below and let us know your thoughts.